some methodological considerations for tourism, hospitality, and event research, whereby we will be discussing the different research methodologies that can be used in research. Remember, our research belongs to the category of social science. Okay, so there are a set of research methodologies that we can use for social science research. We will also be looking at the differences between qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and also look at how we can use both qualitative and quantitative together to form a mixed method approach. And also we will be looking at sampling techniques involved in both of these methodologies and the procedures of how we go about doing the sampling. Okay. All right. First of all, in terms of research approach, we can categorize the approach into two main categories of approaches. Okay, one is called ETIC, ETIC, and another is called EMIC, EMIC. Okay, these are two categories of approaches of social science research. ETIC means all those research design that are positivistic in nature. Positivistic means it includes number. Okay, whereas EMIC is interpretivistic, which means it does not necessarily include number, but emphasis is more on words. Remember, this is positivistic means quantitative, and interpretivistic means qualitative. Okay, so when we take an ETIC approach, that means we are being positivistic. Our position as a researcher is as an outsider. That means we are outside looking inside to understand something. Okay, we are outsider looking inside to understand something from which we will deduce the numbers that we get. We will analyze it and make inferences. Okay, so that is a deductive process. Okay, whereas for EMIC, our role as a researcher in a qualitative research is that we may be part of what is being researched. Okay, we may not just be an observer, but we may also participate in the whole phenomena, and so in that way we become an outsider, an insider. I'm sorry. Where from the amount of information we get through our interpretivistic approach, we will induce what is going on, what is the finding that we can see, and then we can generate qualitative data from that. Okay, so again, two different approaches when we talk about social science research: ETIC and EMIC. Qualitative and quantitative approaches have their strengths and weaknesses, of course, because nothing is perfect, and so both also have advantages and disadvantages. Okay, neither one is markedly superior to the other in all respects. That's according to Akra and Hughes in 1992. Okay, so that's why as a researcher you need to decide based on your objective and research question which one would best suit the purpose of your research, which one, or do you need to use both as in mixed method. Okay, because in many studies there is a need to combine both the qualitative and quantitative approach, because this would give the research the breadth and the depth of the finding that they are looking at. Okay, so it is not about what, but also about why of the thing that the researcher is looking at. Okay, and so selecting the right methodology would depend on the nature of the research topic or the question being asked, the setting, the size and nature of the market. Sometimes your population may be very little, so you cannot really get the number you need for a good sample. So the best way is to go in depth and use qualitative approach. Okay, so the setting makes a difference also on the right methodology that you want to choose in doing your research. Okay, and then also we look at the limitations that we have. What are our constraints in terms of time, in terms of resources, in terms of budget? Okay, and we work around those limitations. Okay, we choose the right methodology that can fit into the limitations that we have. And finally, we also look at the theoretical paradigm that we adopt. But theoretical paradigm means the guidelines from the philosophy of research that we decide to choose and to use to guide our entire research process. So based on that, you will be able to have a clearer idea of what methodology would suit the purpose of your research best. Now, the difference between quantitative and qualitative are many. Okay, quantitative, quantity, is based mainly on the collection and analysis of statistical data. That's why we need the numbers. For quantitative, we need the numbers. It tends to obtain a limited amount of information on a large number of respondents or observation. Why limited amount? The information we get is totally dictated by the questionnaire that we design. The survey questionnaire that we design, whatever we ask there, that is the amount of information that we get from a quantitative approach. You cannot generalize more than that. Okay, so that's why it says limited amount of information from a large number of people, because when we do quantitative, we have to have the sample, and this sampling is based on the population that we are looking at. Okay, whereas qualitative research does not really give importance to the collection and analysis of statistical data. Okay, the emphasis is more on in-depth insight of a relatively small number of respondents and observation. Okay, so maybe when we do qualitative research, we use interview, either semi-structured interview or unstructured interview. So from that interview, we probe and probe and probe so that we get more and more information beyond the question that we initially asked. Okay, so that's how qualitative research works. And from that, you get more information and in-depth insight. Quantitative research measure objective facts. As you remember, objective means non-biased. It is what it is. It is not subjective. Okay, so whatever that is the fact, it is that you measure. So it focuses more on variables. Variables means the construct or the thing that you are using to measure the findings, to get the findings that you are looking at. So the variables can be perception or attitude or responses, anything. Okay, those are variables. Reliability is the key. The research that we do, the quantitative research that we do must be reliable. That means if it is done again, the likelihood of getting the same answer is there. Okay, so that's why the survey instrument has to be constructed based on past research, past study. We cannot just come up with our own questions when we design our survey questionnaire. We have to base our survey questionnaire on questions that has been asked by past researcher. Okay, so that we know our question will generate reliable information. Okay. Quantitative research is also or should be value-free. Value-free here means you as a researcher is totally outside of the phenomenon. You do not judge, you do not add value or give any kind of responses or behavior that can influence the outcome of your finding. Okay, so the researcher take the data that you get as it is. You do not interpret the data. That's why it is positivistic. Yeah, because it relies on objective data. It is positivistic and not interpretivistic. So that means it has to be value free. Otherwise, it is not a good quantitative data. Okay. And so a good value-free quantitative research should be independent of the context. Yeah, you do not really look at the context in order to come with a conclusion about your findings. Okay, and you will rely on a huge number of respondents or observations. Okay, the bigger the sample, the better. But of course, there are standard way of evaluating the size of the sampling we need in order to give us a representative data. Okay, so we will look at that later when we focus more on sampling. And quantitative data will emphasize a lot on statistical analysis. We will have to find things like mean, median, mode. We have to do standard deviation. We have to know what is the margin of error. We have to do all kinds of analysis that will generate some kind of statistical data that we can make inferences from. Okay? So researcher is detached from the subject, because this is the only way you can be objective about what you're looking at. You can be value free. Yeah, it has to be. You have to be outside, an outsider. That's why in this, when you are doing a quantitative research, the approach you are working on is ETIC, ETIC, that we have seen in the past slide. Qualitative research. Hi there. Today we will be looking. What the fuck? Qualitative research are researchers that look at meanings. It doesn't look so much on numbers, but meanings. That's why in-depth. You have to do an in-depth analysis to find meaning about culture, about the social reality. Okay, so you focus more on interactive processes or events. Yeah, the interaction among the respondents or the subjects that you are looking at. How they behave, how they interact, what are things that are important to them. Yeah, that's what you look at as a qualitative researcher. Authenticity is the key. Authenticity here means real. It means true. Yeah, it is not fake. It is not something that is staged. Yeah, so you're looking at authenticity. That's why as a researcher you have to be inside. You have to be an insider. You have to be part of the subjects or the respondents or the observations that you are looking at. Okay. Values are present and explicit because when you, the researcher, are on the inside, all your findings are based on your interpretation of what you see. Okay, so you interpret. That's why this is interpretivism. You interpret based on what you understand on the context or on what's going on in front of your eyes. Yeah, so that's why whatever you may have some kind of value judgment, and this can influence how you interpret what you are looking at. The data that you get will be constrained by context. Okay, so meaning here, what you get as your finding will totally depend on the situation or the context of the subjects or the observation that you get. Okay. Qualitative research needs only a few The number is not important. You can do an analysis of 6 people, and that can give you a good PhD thesis depending on how well you follow all the procedures of a qualitative research. Yeah, but in the end, you will get yourself a good PhD thesis just based on 6 subjects or 6 people. That is possible when you use qualitative research. Okay. When you analyze the data, the words from the interviews that you get, you use thematic analysis. This is the most common type of analysis used for qualitative research. Okay, so when you do this, when you do thematic analysis, when you are interpreting the data that you have, the information that you have, then you are involved. That's why qualitative is an emic process where you are part of the phenomenon and you are involved in the subject as an insider. Then we also have a mixed methodology where we combine both quantitative and qualitative. Again, why we do this? It is because by combining both quantitative and qualitative, we will get better data. We will get more meaningful result. Okay, and we will have a better finding for the research that we are doing. So that's why we can use mixed methods. Mixed methods means we have to triangulate. Triangulation here means we look at all the methods that we use and try to compare and contrast all the findings that we get from all these methods and then make some sense out of it. Okay, create a picture from all the information that you have from both quantitative and qualitative data. Okay, so the mixing of both quantitative and qualitative methodologies can vary in many ways and many degrees. Sometimes you have your main approach is quantitative, but you use also qualitative to give you some information about perception, about feelings, or about whatever more deeper information that you need beyond the number that you get from the quantitative data. Also, you can do it the other way. Your main approach is qualitative, but you need also some numbers to make your qualitative data stronger. So you do some quantitative survey as well to help your main approach, which is qualitative just now, become more justified, more stronger, much stronger. Yeah. So we do that. And by doing mixed method also, we can have a research that is more comprehensive. That means we have better idea about the thing compared to if we just use quantitative or qualitative alone. And then we have a more in-depth idea of meaningful results from the study that we have done. So when we use mixed methodology, triangulation is a very important process because we need to have ideas from all the methods that we have already adopted. Yeah, no single method ever adequately solves the problem of rival causing factors, because each method reveals different aspects of empirical reality. Multiple methods of observation must be employed. This is according to Denzin in 1978. Okay, so we use both quantitative and qualitative to get better results, to get better information, to get better idea, more meaningful research. Okay. So that's why triangulation. It is the use of multiple methods, data sources, investigators or theorists in a research process. So we don't triangulate only the data. Sometimes we triangulate methods. Yeah, we triangulate the sources of information that we get. Okay, or the theories that we use. Yeah, so it can be anything. It depending again on what your research is trying to accomplish. Denzin 1978 also identifies 4 types of triangulation. That is data triangulation, where you look at different types of data and you triangulate them. investigator triangulation. That means you have several investigators looking at the same thing, and then you combine the finding of each of the investigator. Theory triangulation, that means you compare based on the different theories and try to come up with a consensus between the two theories that you have. Or methodological triangulation, where you triangulate. The emphasis is to look at all methodology that is useful for getting that information, and you triangulate that. Okay. If you need more information about triangulation, Denzin has a good publication just focusing on all these 4 types of triangulation that I have mentioned just now. So please be free to go to the library and get these articles that Denzin has produced if you want to understand more about the types of triangulations out there. At this point, though, of your study, we are just introducing the concept without going in depth, because that's what you just need to know about the different types of triangulation out there that is suggested by Denzin. Yeah, but by all means, go to the library and find out more information about how do you do methodological triangulation, how do you do investigative triangulation, and things like that. Okay, I encourage you. Now we're looking at Delphi Technique. This is a technique that uses experts. Yeah, experts can be like the medical doctors, or if we are doing research on tourism, hospitality, and events, then of course the practitioners or the lecturers or professors in those areas. Yeah, so those are the experts, and we give them a set of questions and see how they respond to the questions using repeated rounds. That means we ask them again and again and again in different rounds. Yeah, because in the end we want to try to find consensus. Consensus here means agreement. Yeah, everybody agree on something in the end. That's what Delphi Technique aims to get. Okay. The expert in the field complete a questionnaire indicating their views on the likelihood of certain developments taking place in the future. So they all make their own predictions, yeah, and these views then circulated to the panel members for further comment, a process which might be repeated a number of times before the final result is collated. Okay, so that's why Delphi Technique, you cannot just just do it once. You have to ask them once, and then a month later ask them again, months after that ask them again, to see if you can get a consensus or an agreement in the end. So it's not really an easy technique to do. Actually, you will need to have the ability to get cooperation from all these experts consistently. Okay. Okay, now we are looking at the aspect of sampling. In Malay, we call it persampelan, yeah, sample. Yeah. So we will be looking at the importance of the sampling, yeah, why we need the sampling, the principles of sampling, and the 2 categories of sampling, which is probabilistic sampling and non-probabilistic sampling. Okay, why do we choose a sample? Yeah, why do we need to sample a population? It is because if we are looking at the population per se, the population may be too large to study. Yeah, so let's say your study is on tourists from Middle Eastern countries. So if you just look at the context of the region, Middle Eastern consists of so many different countries. Yeah, you have Saudi Arabia, we have Jordan, you have Lebanon. All those are Middle Eastern countries. Are you going to take all the respondents from all those countries? Of course not. You cannot. Yeah, it is not practical. Remember, when we do research, the research has to be practical. So we take sample from the arrival of Middle Eastern tourists to Malaysia, as the sampling technique. Okay, so we do this when the population is too large or too difficult to access, or we have some kind of limitation in terms of time and budget. Okay, so that's why sampling works for researchers, because it helps make the research more practical, more doable. Okay, it reduces the resource that we need. Yeah, it enables our study to be completed in shorter time, and it enables the findings to be generalized. Yeah, when we do a probability sampling. Okay, generalized here means we can say, based on the findings of one sample, that this is how it works for all the rest of the population. That's generalization. Okay, of course you cannot simply generalize. You have to make sure your data is accurate and reliable and valid before you can say, okay, this data can be generalized towards the bigger population. Okay, research conclusions and generalizations are only as good as the sample they are based on. That's why um, if you have heard the term garbage in, garbage out for quantitative research, quantitative data, it is very true. Whatever that we collect, the data that we collect is as good as the design that we do. Okay, and whatever conclusions that we make from the data analysis is as good as the kind of data that we get. Yeah, and also the sample here. What it means here, the sample, is your sample representative of the population or not? Yeah, you cannot simply take a random person or a specific segment of group of people and say that they represent the population. That is not true. Yeah, so um, you have to follow the procedures of probabilistic sampling, which I will show you later. Okay, so in what you want in the end is a sample that represents the population. Principle of sampling, of course, you have to have systematic and objectively selected samples. Yeah, there are ways to systematically sample the population so that you do not go against this principle of being objective. Yeah, the sampling has to be clearly defined. So before you actually go out to select your sample or to do the sampling, you have to define what sort of sample you need from this population. Yeah, and again, this definition must relate to your research question and research objective. Okay, when we sample, the element of randomization must be there. Okay, because randomization will make sure that one person is sampled only once. Yeah, if they are sampled twice, does that give us an accurate data? Of course, it's not. Okay, they should be sampled only once and without bias. When we randomize, we just pick randomly based on following the procedure of randomization that we will learn later. Then we will do the sampling process without bias using ethical and scientifically justified process. Okay, so with academic research, everything has to be systematic. Everything has to be according to the procedure, according to the rules and norms and regulations. You cannot do something without understanding all this. How do we determine the sample size? The factors that we should be looking at would be the population itself. Yeah. What is the population that you are looking at? Okay, and how can you make sure that this population is adequately represented when you do your sampling? Okay, and also when we decide our sampling, we have to look at how much money you have. Yeah, how much will it cost? Yeah, to sample a tourist from Middle East, for example, you have to know where they are from and how to approach them, where they are located. All this will incur some kind of cost, yeah, in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of human resource. Okay, so that's why we have to be very, very practical when we do this. It also depends on the number of variables involved. Yeah, the more variables we need to look at, then the bigger the sample that we need to have so that our analysis will generate meaningful findings. Okay, and then we also have to determine the sampling selection methods or the technique to be used, which we will be looking at later. We need to also look at how we want to analyze the data after that, and what kind of accuracy we want for the population parameters that we have. So it is important to find out as much as possible about your population. You have to understand, okay, this is the study that I want to do. Who would be the best, what would be the best population to look at, okay? And it has to be accurate. The greater the diversity and differences that exist in your population, the larger your sample should be. Why? Because we need to make sure that our sample is representative. It represents the population that we are looking at. Because if they don't, if it doesn't, then your data is not representative of the population. That means it is not valid. It is not useful or meaningful. Okay? Okay, when we do sample, there are two types of sampling designs, probabilistic sample and non-probabilistic sample. Okay, probabilistic sample means elements in the population have some known chance of being selected. That means we give everybody equal chances of being selected, whereas non-probability means elements do not have known chance of being selected. This happens, yeah, the non-probabilistic elements will occur when we do convenience sampling. Convenience sampling means you just take anybody that you meet and that's your sample. Whereas when you do a probabilistic sample, you do not do this. You have to follow a certain procedures, okay, in order to make sure that it is a probabilistic sample. So you need to decide between the two types of sampling, which approach, which one that you would best suit your research. Okay, we look at probabilistic sampling. There are four types of probabilistic sampling that you must be familiar with. First is simple random sampling, which I will explain later in the next slide. The next one is stratified random sampling. And then we have systematic sampling. And finally, we have cluster or multi-stage sampling. Simple random sampling, it is a process of selecting a sample in such a way that all individuals in the defined population have an equal and independent chance of being selected for a sample. It is the best single way to obtain a representative sample. That means you just, for example, number the people in that population and put all these numbers in a hat or a box or something, and then just randomly take from that box or from that hat the number one after another, so that each one of them have a single chance of being picked. That is a simple random sampling. Okay, random sampling involves defining the population. We must define the population first. Who do we want to study? Yeah, identify each member of the population. to see the kind of diversity in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of this, in terms of that, yeah, so that we make sure we have a representative sample. And selecting individuals for the sample on a completely chance basis. That's why I said you number them, you put all those numbers in a box and you randomly take, okay? And that is chance basis. A random sample is generally selected using a table of random numbers, okay? Sarah Takos in 1998 outlines a number of simple random sampling techniques. First is lottery method. Lottery is means like what I have mentioned just now. You put all the numbers in a hat or a box or something, and then you take one after another. That is lottery. Just like when you watch the lottery system on TV or something like that, where the number comes out only once and it is purely random. Okay. It can also use computer method, name method, date of birth method, or number of method, or table of random numbers. Okay, but out of all these proposed ways, lottery method is the most common method that people use when they want to do random sampling. Then we have stratified sampling. This is a process of selecting a sample in such a way that identified subgroups in the population are represented in the sample in the same proportion that they exist in the population. Yeah. So, for example, you have a population that consists of Malay, Chinese, Indians, but the Malays will be like 75%, and then Chinese will be like 50%, and then Indians will be like 30%. So when you sample, you make sure that your sample consists of exactly the same proportion. You have to take more Malays compared to the Chinese and more Chinese compared to the Indians, like that, so that we make sure that each of the races in this population is represented properly. Okay. Can also be used to select equal size samples from each of the subgroups if the subgroup comparisons are desired. Yeah, so you can not use proportionate if you want to do comparison. It's okay too. And the steps in stratified sampling are very similar to those in random sampling, except that selection is from subgroups in the population rather than the population as a whole. Okay, so this is more tedious because you have to do a lot more than just simple random sampling. You have to make sure you know the diversity in that population. You know what are the subgroups in that population and how many are they, in terms of in relative to the whole entire population. And from then you select. Okay, so it is a more tedious method, but more accurate compared to the simple random sampling. And steps in stratified sampling includes, first of all, identifying and defining the population. This is actually a step for all kinds of sampling. You have to understand the population first before you know how to sample them. Okay, so you have to identify and define your population first. Okay, and then you decide the desired sample size, how big or small size of sample that you want. Of course, big sample is better, but you do not necessarily need big numbers all the time, as long as it is representative of the population. Okay, and then you identify the variable and the subgroups. This will give you the strata or the components of that population, so that you make sure that you have representativeness for them. Yeah. And then you randomly select using a table of random numbers, an appropriate number for each of the subgroup, so that you can make sure each of the subgroups are represented. Cluster. You know cluster, right? Cluster is like a clump or something. Yeah, they're not equally distributed. Okay, so cluster sampling is also a good probabilistic sampling that we can adopt. Okay, this is where we select groups rather than individuals. Okay, and wherever the cluster that you find, that is what you sample. Yeah, this cluster can be anywhere. It is an intact group of similar characteristics. That's why we call it cluster. Okay, the steps in cluster sampling are similar to those in random sampling, like what we have seen in random sampling and stratified sampling just now, except that the random selection of groups is involved rather than individuals. Okay, so you select groups rather than individuals when you do cluster sampling. Again, when we want to do cluster sampling, first and foremost, identify and define the population, determine the desired sample size, identify and define a logical cluster. This is very important. That means you must first understand the population before you understand about the cluster that it has, and then only you can select your cluster. You do your cluster sampling properly. Yeah, list out the cluster that comprise the population, and then you do the sampling. You also need to estimate the average number of population members in each cluster. Okay, determine the number of clusters needed by dividing the sample size by the estimated size of a cluster, and include in your study all population members in each selected cluster. So you have already identified the cluster, you look at the size of each cluster, and you make sure that the number you get from each cluster is representative of that particular cluster size. Yeah. So in the end, you have um, a clustering technique that represent the population. Then we have systematic sampling. Systematic sampling is sampling in which individuals are selected from a list by taking every X name or case name or whatever alphabet that you want to use here, where that equals the number of individuals and the list divided by the number of subjects desired for the sample. Okay, again, it equals the number of individuals in the list divided by the number of subjects desired for the sample. So let's say you want to have every 10th person or every 15th person that enters into a certain national park, for example. So that's the one that represent your sample. You can do that in a systematic sampling. Even though choices are not independent, a systematic sample can be considered a random sample if the list of the population is randomly ordered in a relatively infrequent event. Okay, so you will choose just the 10th person or the 15th person from the number of entrants into that national park, and we can still consider this as a random sampling technique. Yeah, because we do not know who will enter. Who will be the 10th person that will enter, who will be the 15th person that will enter. So that is random. Anybody can be selected. In doing systematic sampling, again, we have to identify or understand the population. Okay, and then we will start at some random place at the top of the population list, and take every X number name on that list, so until you get the total sample size that you need. Yeah. If the end of the list is reached before the desired sample is reached, go back to the top of the list. Okay, so you have to have an idea first how many you want for your sample, and then from that, what is the X or case number of person that you want to select as your sample, and then continue with this. Yeah, so that's why it is called systematic. You have a systematic way of selecting the person or the individuals or the subjects that can become your sample. Non-probabilistic sampling would be convenient sampling. I mentioned to you just now how convenience sampling is not really what we want. Um, if we want to make sure we have a good um, statistical data, yeah, but it is there to be chosen if you want to do your research, yeah. But of course, your interpretation will not be accurate, yeah, because this is also called accidental sampling or haphazard sampling. Haphazard means it is not systematic. And when you want to do a quantitative approach, you have to have systematic ways of doing it. Okay, so if you do convenience sampling, then this will cause a major bias in your findings. Yeah, because it can be anything, and there is no system to make sure that your sample represent the population. Two major examples of convenience samples are the use of volunteers, yeah, and the use of existing groups just because they are there. Non-probabilistic sampling can also be involving what we call judgment sampling or purposive sampling. So this is a little bit like convenience sampling, but purposive sampling is more systematic in the way that the person or the subject serve a certain purpose for your research. Yeah, it is often used in social science research, and it involves selecting a sample which is believed to be representative of a given population. Yeah, so the researcher uses expert judgment to select a representative sample. So this is more systematic because it is not just based on convenience. You know that the person or the subject that you take as your sample represent the population in some ways. Okay. Quota sample is another non-probabilistic sampling. It is often used in survey research using interviews. It involves giving interviewers exact numbers or quotas of persons of varying characteristics who are to be interviewed. You know quota, right? Quota means proportion of something, and you have to have that number in order for the thing you're looking at to be represented. Okay, so you do this and you use this as the basis of your sampling. So again, this is like a summary of what we have been looking at, random and non-random sampling just now. Okay, random sampling would involve a structured and systematic way of selecting who become our subject, who participate in our survey. Okay, whereas non-random, we don't have any structure or any system. Okay, and then in terms of opportunity of individuals or units to participate in our study, random sampling gives us equal chance that everyone can be involved. Yeah, whereas non-random, because it doesn't have any structure or system, then it gives unequal chance. In terms of representativeness of the population, using random sampling, we can be sure that our sample represent the population. Whereas using non-random sampling, we cannot be sure. We cannot confidently say that our sample really represent the population that we are studying. Okay, so as a result, applicability of the findings will be affected. Yeah, because we can be confident that our population is represented, then we can generalize our findings back to the population. Whereas if we use non-random sampling, then this can be, we can only interpret this as a case specific. We cannot really generalize it to the population that we are looking at. Rather, we tie it back to the group that we actually looked at. Okay, so in summary, random sampling is much better than non-random sampling when we are trying to do a research, a social science research. So be sure to do this when you do your academic research one day. Yeah, choose a random sampling rather than a non-random sampling when you want to decide on your sampling process. Okay, so that's the end of the topic that we are looking at today. Thank you very much. See you next time.